Welcome back to the Poor Pro's Almanac. This is Andy, and today we're joined by Bill Finch. Now, Bill is one half of what's called Finch Conservation, which him, together with his wife, Beth Boehner Finch, focuses on land conservation and education. Together, they produce critically acclaimed books, offer comprehensive consulting services, and assist in developing large-scale land conservation programs in the Southeast. One area of focus is with Paint Rock Forest Research Center, which we'll talk about later. Bill's book, which we dive into, is titled Longleaf, Far as the Eye Can See, A New Vision of North America's Richest Forest. The book takes readers on a visual and narrative journey into the longleaf pine forests of the southeastern United States. These forests are highlighted as the most biologically diverse and complex forest ecosystems in North America. Historically, the longleaf forest covered a vast area of 92 million acres, from Florida to Texas and as far north as Maryland. But its range has significantly diminished to scattered remnants totaling approximately 3 million acres due to factors like overharvesting and urban encroachment. Finch and his co-authors advocate for saving the longleaf forest, emphasizing that its unique ecosystem challenges conventional ideas of what a forest should be. They explain that unlike Appalachian forests, where dense canopies limit sunlight, a longleaf forest thrives by encouraging other plants to grow in its thin shade, resulting in a grassy savanna teeming with life. This point is reinforced by plant studies cited in the book, which identified approximately 925 endemic species in coastal plain longleaf forests, compared to fewer than 170 species in the entire Appalachian province. Needless to say, when I stumbled across Bill's work, I had to reach out. So take a listen to our chat, and please grab a copy of his book at the links in the show notes. Bill, thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you.
First, let me ask, how did you get into conservation?
Running around in the woods.
The best way.
As a kid.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up in Mississippi and Alabama. And there were only so many ways to entertain yourself without getting in a whole lot of trouble. And being in the woods was one of those ways. And I really learned to love that. I grew up in mostly small towns, and there were always woods never too far away, whether it was the Pearl River swamps or the Mobile Delta or the pine lands. There was always a place to be. I remember my grandmother taking me down from her house through the woods, through the longleaf pine savannas that surrounded her house, which were incredibly rich, and down to the little creek. And she said, "Now, here are trumpets. These are the trumpets. Aren't they beautiful?" And it took me years later to realize that trumpets were pitcher plants, which are these rare carnivorous plants that are part of that ecosystem. And these are the things I kind of grew up with as a natural part of who I was. It stayed with me. I went off to study languages in college, and I said, this isn't what I want to do. I want to be back with the woods. So I went back into forestry. But it's always been that it was that really important contact with the woods when I was very young.
Yeah, and I got to imagine being in that kind of ecosystem set a certain expectation for what a forest should look like, too.
Yeah, and it's not that, of course, those forests were as degraded as many national forests are across the country, but it was there, and things we took for granted. I remember when I went to forestry school, and when I was visiting other places in the country, I suddenly, I was used to so many species in such a small area. And I went to New England, and I went to the Northeast and the Northwest, and the forests were beautiful there. And and probably in 20 minutes time, I knew every species that was there. I wasn't very smart in those days about plants, but there just wasn't the kind of hyper diversity that you see in the Southeast. And that was sort of a revelation, was, gosh, what you're used to is not typical.
Yeah, I live in the Northeast, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And I did live in the South for a bit, and I happened to be in Georgia last fall. And I remember walking around in one of the national parks and just like, yeah, jaw dropping. Now I know a lot more about plants than I did when I lived in South Carolina 15, 20 years ago. And just being amazed at the natural diversity that was there compared to coming back at home, where just to your point, you feel like if you know a couple dozen species, you've pretty much got most of the major, what you're going to see in a forest around here, kind of figured out. And it didn't always used to be that way, as we were talking about before we started recording. So one thing you've gotten into or gotten involved with is what you've called Finch Conservation and the Painted Rock Forest Research Center. Could you talk a little bit about these and kind of what your vision is for these projects?
Yes. So there was a guy named E.O. Wilson, pretty famous scientist at Harvard, who was from Alabama. And when I was writing a number of years back, he called me and said, "Look, I grew up in Alabama as you did, and I want you to show me some of those places because I only had my bicycle when I was growing up, and I couldn't visit those places. So show me those places." And so we began looking around, and then we began thinking, "Gosh, this is a great center of diversity, and it really is. So how do we preserve it, and how do we draw people's attention to it?" And that was the beginning of Finch Conservation in a big way. And we began working on projects throughout the state. My wife and I worked on a book about one of the great ecosystems in Alabama, the Longleaf pine ecosystem, and as part of that project. But eventually, I paired up with another very famous scientist named Stephen Hubble, who is head of the evolutionary biology department at UCLA. And I was working at Nature Conservancy at the time. I was director of conservation in Alabama for the Nature Conservancy. And Hubble came to me and said, "Look, I really have this great program for understanding evolution and ecology and how they interact. And it's something I started in Barro, Colorado, in Panama, and it became very famous as part of the Forest Geo Network that Smithsonian runs." And he said, I really want to do this in a diverse temperate forest in North America. We've done it in tropical forests, but we want to know what temperate forests are like. And Ed was noodling me, E.O. Wilson was noodling me to say, yeah, we need research centers in the South to really begin thinking about this. And so those two ideas converged, and we looked all around the Southeast for a great place to do it. And we ended up in a place in Northeast Alabama called Paint Rock, which is on a beautiful river, the Paint Rock River. It's named for the artwork that's ancient, the pre-Columbian artwork that's all around the river and on the bluffs and in the caves. It's the center of cave diversity in North America. It's the center of deciduous forest diversity in North America. It's the center of fish diversity in North America. This basin is center of mussel diversity in North America. Center of crawfish diversity in the world. More species of crawfish now in Alabama, 105, getting close to 105 species of crawfish, a lot of them in this basin. So it was kind of the perfect place to work. And so we set up a research center where we decided we're going to use as a backbone Steve Hubble's program, where you look at, say, 150 acres and you look at every stem bigger than a pencil in that 150 acres, and you follow it for 50 years. You measure it, you identify it, you tag it, you give it a number, you map it. And we've done that now on 60 hectares, 150 acres. And we have 86,000 stems that we're following for 50 years. And we're already finding really incredible stuff. And that's just part of the research we do, but it's a big part of the backbone. We're doing overlays, looking at ants for the first time, some of the forest ants, looking at the reproductive flights of those ants. We're doing DNA work that's not been done in forests before at the scale we're doing it. Pretty excited about it. The cave research is unbelievable. And we're getting into the aquatic research as well. Funding for aquatic research is getting more difficult because Fish and Wildlife has only $1 on their credit cards right now. I won't say why, but but we're getting into the aquatic research as well, and it's really a great place to be, and a sometimes stressful project, but always a very good and productive one.
Yeah, I mean, I know some folks that work in conservation for fisheries down that way, and yeah, the amount of, again, I feel like we just keep saying this, the amount of diversity of species is just unreal, and they need to be protected. And the fact that there's as much diversity as there is today is kind of heartbreaking when you think about it, because how much we've lost and we don't even know we've lost. And I know, for example, like we used to have, I think, two species of parrot in the United States,
That's
and
right. That's right.
they're both extinct now. And it's, how many species do we not even know about?
Yeah.
And that's the scary part.
We're tracing, and we're tracing the loss of these extinctions. What happens as a result of these extinctions, and we can see, I think, the effects here in the forest on certain species, on the community types, with the loss of the Carolina parakeets. Both of those parakeet species are probably, we only had one here, the Carolina parakeet, but we can see that loss. We can also see the great loss of passenger pigeons,
Mm.
which we know had a huge role to play, for example, in bamboo and the great bamboo forests of the South, which we called cane brakes,
Hmm.
and which were hugely important in terms of the mammals they supported, in terms of the other birds they supported. So the loss of passenger pigeons also made it more difficult for the canebrakes to survive and the parakeets to survive and all these other birds. So it just sort of is a knock-on thing that we're really still seeing the effects of. But there is much left. And even with, Alabama is the starting backwards, Alabama is the center on the continent of the continental states. It is the center of extinction in the nation. Only Hawaii has more extinctions. Why that is a really interesting story. But even with that, we're still the center of biodiversity in Eastern North America. And that's really an interesting story to talk about right now. Why is Alabama so diverse? Gosh, of all places, why would Alabama be so biologically diverse? And does that matter to anybody else? Does that matter to New Jersey? Does that matter to New England? And I'm going to say yes, it does. And I think understanding that is about understanding diversity is the one word we're not supposed to use, and the other word we're not supposed to use anymore is climate. And understanding climate is hugely important, not just the present day, but time and climate and how they've interacted. It's always good to remember when you're thinking about ecology in North America and when you're thinking about forest and when you're thinking about the future, you have to remember that 18,000 years ago, virtually everything north of Washington, D.C. was covered in glaciers, and nothing lives under a glacier. There's nothing, maybe tardigrades.
Mm.
Interested to see if we find any tardigrades or some kind of virus, but there's no trees, there's no
We'll
grasses.
find out.
That's right. What happens when those glaciers emerge and cover a landscape is it's all wiped out. And where does it go? Well, actually, it doesn't go anywhere. It sort of resides in warehouses, in storehouses, strongholds, whatever you want to call them, places that have been relatively immune to climate change, relatively over millions of years. And Alabama, Northwest Florida, Georgia, and to some degree the Carolinas and Mississippi were those strongholds in Eastern North America. And so we had this huge refugia of species that escaped this climate change. And that's really important because you might have heard the climate's changing again. And so what happens when New England, which has maybe 12 species of oaks, what happens when climate change begins making it difficult for those oaks to grow? The 40 species of oaks in Alabama may play a very important role in the future of New England, and it already does. Elms are wiped out, American elms. The story is, of course, that American elms are wiped out across North America, but they're not. Across the northern tier of states, the American elms are hugely lost, and there's really a real panic about what are we going to do about restoring American elms. It's almost like the chestnut blight story, except that American elms are abundant in Alabama and much of the Southeast. And the reason they're abundant is because the genetic diversity among American elms is much higher here because it never had to go through the keyhole of glaciers
Mm.
and getting up north. So the restoration of American elms depends on, I'm sorry to say, Alabama and Tennessee and Georgia. And that's where it comes from. And that's why it's so important to protect it. And I could go through that list of species over and over.
Yeah.
It's just going to be hugely important as climate changes. The heat tolerance of these species, the pathogen tolerance of these species, incredible genetic diversity of these species in the South, and the diversity of species themselves are all going to play a huge role as climate changes.
And I'm curious about your thoughts to expand on that about the idea of a human's role in moving those species north, because this idea of like climate refugees, depending on specific species, it may get too hot and they need to move north faster than they naturally can because of that acceleration of the climate. So I'm curious about kind of where you stand on that, what you think people should be doing.
Yeah, so it's important to know we don't have any elephants anymore. We don't have the mechanisms. We have Atlanta now. We have Washington, D.C. We have Nashville. We have all of these big impediments to moving species that occurred relatively slowly at one time, but now it's going to be even more slow. And there are all sorts of roadblocks on the way. We have got to start having intelligent discussions about how to move species northward. Otherwise, those gaps will be occupied by invasive species from other countries, more than likely. And that's already happening in many cases. So we need those intelligent discussions, and we need to be thinking about it more. I don't say it should be careless, and I don't say it should be amateurish. I think it needs to be things we do research on and think about, oh, so what are the impacts, and what are we really trying to accomplish here? I think filling the gap with American elms is probably a no-brainer, but we do have to think about, okay, so what are the genetics of these American elms? We may actually be the genetics across the group of plants we call American elms are so divergent that we may actually be looking at multiple species. So is it okay to introduce another species that resembles American elm as it moves northward? And so a lot of really important discussion, but we've got to have the discussion.
Yeah.
Or it happens in a way that is not very good.
Yeah. And we talk about these symbiotic relationships between plants and animals. As we've been talking, I keep thinking about there's all these plants that don't have a whole lot of specialist relationships with insects, but they've been around for a long time. And I start thinking about, there probably were more specialist relationships, but the other plants they needed to survive on either don't exist, or other species that they needed to rely on don't exist. And then talking about like Dutch elm, or American elm rather, how many species are holding on by a thread waiting for something to move in and kind of fill that gap?
Right. Yeah. Yes. And yes, there are lots of cases. It's probably oftentimes it's the really small species that mattered the most that we don't think about. We like to think about things like trees because they're big, and certainly I do, and certainly that's our focus. But it's many small plants that may have been a cornerstone species in a way that we don't recognize. Grasses and broadleaf herbs that were once really, really important and aren't there anymore because they were supporting a tons of insect life, for example, that may have been very beneficial to the trees themselves. It's the interaction of all of those things that becomes really important. You're right. It's interesting. There's a big debate right now, and part of the fun discussion is, did forests move traditionally before humans got here? Did forests move as a unit, or did they move as individual items in response to climate change? And there's probably something a little bit in between in that whole discussion, but we really have to nail that and understand that, yes, species can move individually, but they bring a lot of things with them, including things like things in the soil that may be necessary for those trees to survive in certain places. And we're really beginning to pick up on that. I think we like to tell the really cozy stories about what happens in the soil. Oh, they're communicating with each other. They're saying nice things to each other, but there's lots of pathogens in the soil. There's 10,000 species in a few acres of soil down here. And they're performing all kinds of roles, and we have to appreciate that. And some of those soil creatures may determine the future of American elms.
Yeah.
And we're just not aware of them. So we've really got to really turn up our work on understanding the interactions of these really small creatures with the really big ones.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. A big thing now in like the farming agricultural communities, this idea of like using various sprays that have what they call IMOs, or indigenous microorganisms, meaning the microbial life in the soil. But at this point, it's just like, this is healthy, quote unquote, healthy soil. So the microbes in it are good. So let's grow those and spread those everywhere. But it is a lot more complicated. And it's a reminder that we're kind of at the like using leeches to solve medical issues point of understanding the soil.
That's exactly right. Great analogy.
Like, we have to at least acknowledge that's where we're at.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, that's it. And it is scary. I mean, this is this back pocket ecology that we're all tempted to exercise every now and then based on a few field observations. But yeah, it's far more complicated than simply taking soil from one place and putting it in another. And the soil community changes from soil to soil and place to place. And we don't understand why those changes occur, but there's a huge difference in soil communities. It's a very complicated subject, and I don't and many people have been turned off by even thinking about it because it's so complicated, or they try to simplify it, make it simplistic, which is not a good thing, so that it's not so hard for people to understand. It's not so hard for us to decide how we're going to make this technology out of this and all this kind of stuff. But no, I think we have to tackle it as a complicated problem and be realistic about it. But we can't avoid tackling it. It is so important to our future.
Yeah, to kind of circle back to where we started with talking about the southeastern forests, you got really attached to the longleaf pine and ended up making that book with your wife about it. So can you talk about why you were like, I want to make a book? It's kind of like almost like a coffee table book about the longleaf pine and the savanna ecosystem of the Southeast.
Yeah, it was so it was this my great discovery because we're all taught that we all grow up learning that forests are about oaks, and which I love, and about hickories, which I love. I'm working in them now.
You're about to get a phone call from Doug telling me.
Yeah, that's right. So the realization, and it took me a long time. I was probably in college before I fully realized that those pitcher plant bogs that Grandma was showing me, how unusual they were, and that they were as much a part of this story as the oaks and hickories I was reading about and loved as well. And really, that book was a great exploration on my part, just sort of an old love letter to a love that I didn't give due attention when I was younger. So we started thinking about that, and as we were writing the book, that a lot of new research is coming out about these savanna communities. Thinking about what is this? Forests are often savannas, and we think of savannas as only being associated with Africa, which is fine. They have a certain type of savanna, but the New Jersey Pine Barrens is a savanna community. And it's not a typical forest in that the canopy isn't closed. And suddenly I looked around my feet and I realized, gosh, I really like this. This is really beautiful. This is the place where there are wildflowers that bloom all year long because they have sunlight all year long. This is the place where quail live because they have plenty of food and they're not scavenging in a sort of a charnel house of dead leaves. There's always something growing there. And it's these savanna complexes that made me realize, gosh, this is a whole new way of thinking about a forest. And it was very exciting. And we were all on the cusp of that growing appreciation for these pine communities. That's what led to the book. My wife was already working on it. She was already keyed into it and had been taking pictures for years. So we put that together into this book. And the more we explore, the more we realize that there are lots of types of savanna communities in North America that we've just ignored, and many other types of pine communities. So now we're very much into the shortleaf pine community, which extends into New Jersey, into the Pine Barrens, and down through Cincinnati as sort of its old northern limit, and then back down through Tennessee, and then all the way into Florida and back across into Arkansas and Oklahoma, a huge forest of shortleaf savannas that have been virtually wiped out in many places, maybe even more endangered than longleaf in some ways, that had its own endemism and its own special role to play in North American history. So we're working on that. And then we're finding that oaks and hickories also have their own savannas as well. So I think the exploration of longleaf was about this tree, this incredible tree, this beautiful tree that lives, gosh, we've got 500, 600-year-old specimens of longleaf. It's an incredibly long-lived tree for the Southeast. Played an incredible role in the history of the nation. I mean, New York was built with longleaf, and London was built with longleaf pine. But rediscovering the ecology of that pine, but also the ecology of that forest, which was so incredible. And it's the savanna that we really rediscovered through longleaf. And longleaf has led us to many savannas.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think you note in your book there's over 900 species that are endemic to those longleaf savannas.
Yeah. And that's probably conservative. That's plants. And we've got lots of other insects that we probably haven't even cataloged yet, and lots of plants that we're still splitting off and realizing, oh gosh, we just never looked very hard. And we're realizing just in the grasses alone, the grass diversity in these longleaf savannas blows your mind. I mean, we don't even have common names for all these grasses, and they're so incredibly diverse. And I often say 100 acres of a good longleaf savanna is going to have more grass species than all the Flint Hills of Kansas. It's just incredible diversity just with the grasses, and then the sedges, and then the broadleaf plants, and then the carnivorous plants that are just out of the world, and the asters and the sunflowers. There are so many ways to say this that we don't recognize it. Every sunflower in the world is native to North America, including the ones originally that were in Ukraine that we see as part of that culture. But they all originate in North America, and there are 52 species of sunflowers in the world, maybe a couple more, but about 52, and there's 26 to 27 of those species in Alabama, and so many of them are in these savanna type habitats, and it's probably the global center of these savannas are the global center of sunflower diversity for sure, and in the Southeast, and we just don't even think about that and how unexplored those sunflowers are. I mean, we use one or two species for whatever we do, human uses, but gosh, there's so many other species out there, and they're so neat, and they probably have so many uses that we've never even considered.
Yeah, I think uh, I want to say there's a book, it's probably like 100 years old now, about, I think it's called 400 Years of the Cherokee or something like that. And it's just someone went to some Cherokee elders and asked them to talk about plants. And it was something, several hundred species of plants that were used for food. Whereas like the average American today has like 30 species that they may consume, all of which have been wildly domesticated.
Right.
And that's just the plants they knew for consumption, never mind other things. And I think it speaks to like, if you value it, then you tend to keep it around, whereas we don't. So we don't keep it around, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I always like to say is we just got off the boat with Columbus.
Mhm.
I mean, we don't really have a clue what's here. We lost much of that ancient knowledge that had developed over 15, 16, 17,000 years through lots of mistakes and lots of successes. But we lost that. We lost that 10,000, 15,000 years of knowledge. And we just barely explored it. I mean, we bring this European mindset, no matter where we're from. We seem to bring this European mindset to this continent, and in terms of what we grow and what we think we can eat, and how we view plants, and even our very naming system for plants, whether it's common or Latin, is so based on something that was developed in Europe, which is Europe's a fine place, but it's pretty impoverished where species are concerned.
Mm.
And it's just that people there have been thinking about it and working on it for so long. And we haven't spent any time really working on our own flora, on our own possibilities, the way people in Asia have, for example.
Yeah.
And so we don't really have a sense of the value of our own place and our own plants and our own world, but it's very valuable. One of the reasons why we're rethinking the grasses and the grains that they produce and our native grasses, and what's the potential for grains among those native grasses is one of the many things we're thinking about here.
Yeah. I do a lot of research on native plants, and the amount of stuff that I see come out of China that they're researching our plants that we don't research,
Right.
or at least we're not getting funding for research. It's absolutely heartbreaking to see other people care about our species more than we do.
Yes, and China doesn't always do well. They've rebuilt their forests with a lot of American tree species, which has got to come back to haunt them after a while.
Yeah, not to say that they've done everything right, but just seeing them
But
put the investing the time in our species that we're not.
we're not, and we really, it's one of the great gaps is we have no idea where we are.
Mm.
I mean, we have no idea what's out there. Who has 40 species of, who can name 40 species of oaks? I mean, it would just blow people's minds. I mean, we got red oaks, we got white oaks. No, we got 40 species of oaks, and they're all very different. And this is just in Alabama. And, we're the global center of hickory diversity. And how many hickories can people name? It's easier than the oaks. You only have to remember 15, 16 species globally, but 12, 13, 14 species are here in North America. And who can name them? Very few people. So we don't know what's out there. And when you don't have a name for it, it's a pretty good sign you don't have a clue what's in the forest
Mm.
or how that forest works.
Yeah, it's really sad. There's so much opportunity for us to rethink how we do so many things just by utilizing what's around us. And I feel like every year we see, or every few years, you'll see an article come out from like Times Magazine or something, and it's about, researchers are optimistic about finding new species that can help us cure cancer and this and that in India because there's so much diversity. And it's like, again, there's so much here. We don't need to go to India to go find diversity. It's here. We have untapped amounts of stuff to research here, and we're not doing it.
Yeah,
and it's easily accessible.
And it's good to remember that one of the really important cancer therapies that was developed, it was developed from a plant that's endemic to a few counties in North America, a yew relative. Yes, there are a lot of things here, and cancer is not the only problem we have to deal with.
Yeah.
But yes, if that's one of the things we talk about, and yes, those things are here. We do very little research here on those plants, and it's also important to remember that the forests have an intrinsic value in and of themselves, even if they don't feed us or cure us. They're our walls and roof. They're the floor underneath us. They're absolutely intrinsic to our survival on their own, and we have to do a better job of understanding and protecting them.
Yeah, I would agree. One of the other things that you guys do with the conservation work is identify and try to protect and lands that you argue have high conservation value. Could you talk a little bit about what that is and kind of what that means?
I often say that conservation in many places is about finding places to walk your dog, but it's more important than that. And it is, we are prioritizing areas where we can preserve and research that huge genetic diversity that is part of Alabama. So we're not just prioritizing pretty spaces, which are great, and it's a way of introducing people to where they are, and that's important. And having people walk their dogs through the forest is important too. But understanding that what we're preserving is genetic diversity, species diversity over a broad area so that we can study it and apply it to the future. These are assets. And I think of every forest is an asset. Some forests are more valuable as an asset than others. They have more assets in them. And those assets are human assets as well. They are our choices for the future as climate changes. And if we keep reducing our choices as climate changes dramatically around us, we're going to be in a real fix because we're not going to have those choices for the future. So we think about this. I mean, we prioritize areas in our minds that help us to preserve the choices for the future. And that becomes really important in any conservation effort. We look at multiple habitat types. It's so interesting. We've done a pretty good job of preserving areas that are on mountain slopes because it was too hard to develop them. So they were less expensive. And we've preserved those pretty well here in Painting Rock Valley, but we didn't preserve the bottoms. where the river flows because it was good for agriculture. And when we used to really practice agriculture in North America, something besides cotton and soybeans and corn, but it's still moderately good for agriculture. And then there's the plateau tops here, which are these longleaf savannas, and we've done a very poor job of preserving those. So we'll also go to look to pick up those areas of biodiversity that have been missed by earlier conservation efforts. When we say, oh, the old word from the past administration was 30 by 30, we've had various ideas about how to do conservation over the years, but it matters a lot where that conservation is done and prioritizing not only where forests are now and where that diversity is, but where forests are going. And that's something that northern states are going to have to think a lot about. Not just where's the current biodiversity, but where will be the biodiversity in 2075? And if you're not thinking about 2075, you're not doing good conservation.
Yeah. I guess the thing that I struggle to wrap my head around is how do we get people to care about this? What is the carrot that you're using to get people to invest, to buy land, to protect land? Is it primarily through grants, or is it goodwill, like getting people to care, or like how are you selling it to people as this is something you should invest in?
Oh, 6 months ago, that was a much easier question, wasn't it? So we've lost one of our big funding sources, which is the feds. I don't know how much we've lost it. We don't know yet. It's everybody's object was, oh, we're going to make this federal lands when we do conservation. And sometimes those federal lands were well managed and sometimes they weren't. And they were always controversial and they were always in the middle of some fight or another. But we've lost it as an opportunity, I think, for a while. I don't think we'll lose it forever, but it's going to be more difficult. I do think that we're going to have to think very carefully about having NGOs, non-government organizations, play a larger role in land conservation, not just in terms of funding, because when we think about funding, we think about buying the land, but I'm talking about in terms of managing the land. There are a lot of organizations I've worked for and worked with, and they all do a great job. Almost none of them sign on for long-term management of lands. And this is going to be a big issue. And it's probably even a bigger issue than buying the lands right now is how are we going to manage these? And management, you can't just buy a piece of land and leave it be because we've already disrupted all of the mechanisms that were used to naturally manage that forest. We got rid of the elephants, dadgummit. We got rid of the stilt-legged horses. That was early on, but then we replaced it. Then fire came in and played some of that role. And fire increased its role, took up the slack. And we had fire helping to manage these forests and increase the diversity. And it made possible those pitcher plant bogs that grandma took me to. And all of those, fire was so important. And fire doesn't happen naturally anymore because we've done everything we can to suppress fire, to keep it from happening, because we thought it was a bad thing. Because Walt Disney said, oh gosh, look at poor Bambi in the forest. He's about to be burned up by a fire. And this affected my grandma even. And it affected a whole generation. And so we've lost that fire. And so, but we got to have it. Who's doing that management? Who's restoring the rivers? Because the rivers we see now are nothing like the rivers that were here 150, 200 years ago. They've been really altered in some pretty dramatic ways, in ways we barely recognize. One of my good friends, Stephen Applebaum, who runs a conservation service, talked about when he was in school, he went to his professor, Luna Leopold, Aldo Leopold's son, and Luna was assigning him to look at streams and to find the streams that were there in the 19th century and compare them to the 20th century. And Steve went back to his professor and Luna and said, look, I can't find these streams. There are no names. And the realization was the streams weren't even there. It was just these little meandering brooks that flowed like deltas through these meadows. Mm. And they had been converged into these modern streams. And then we gave them names. And getting that back to where those meadows were with these little meandering brooks running through them who's going to do that?
Yeah.
Who's going to do that effort? So there's a lot of management that needs to go into it, and it's got to be what we think. And there aren't many groups out there who really think about long-term ownership and long-term management. And now, boy, we better start thinking about it really hard when we realize what can happen when the Fed decides to start selling parklands.
Yeah.
It's a really important thing for the future.
Yeah. Regardless of people's politics, I think there was a very big awakening for a lot of folks when Trump started cutting a lot of stuff that's going on right now of how tenuous a lot of this can be. And to your point that we need to figure something out that's sustainable, that works, and holds people accountable for future generations in a way that we haven't really figured out yet.
Yeah, you want to say, "Oh, I got a solution right away." I think there are some, and I think we can start applying them. But yes, we've got to really change our thinking about how all this works. How radical does that change have to be? I'm not sure what words to use, but it may not be as radical as we think initially. It may just be that we need to begin thinking about how we fit into places, how we fit into systems. And once we begin to understand that, I think it becomes a lot easier. And I don't think it has to be exorbitantly expensive compared to things we spend money on. Mostly conservation and restoration is pretty small. I mean, it's a fraction. Even to do, oh, it would be fun to actually come up with a number for what do we really need to do great conservation in Eastern North America, for example, in all of Eastern North America. What's that number? But even if you look at a number like that, it's still a fraction of what we spend on defense or what we spend on a lot of other things. And you think, oh, well, it's just about making pretty. It's not about making pretty. It's about literally our survival as humans. And I think we have to begin to stress that it is as important, maybe protecting us from missiles from other countries is pretty important for our future too. But let me also say it doesn't matter if we've lost the environment that keeps us alive. So I think we need to emphasize that this is about our future. This is about how well we live in the future. This is about our
Mm.
livelihood future.
Yeah.
And investment seems pretty small.
Yeah. The quality of life for our children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
The environment is our buffer against climate change. We're not doing anything about climate change, and then we're not doing anything about the buffer either. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch in some ways. But one of the things I noticed in your book is that you seem optimistic, cautiously optimistic, I'll say. In the book, you're focused on the longleaf pine, but I think broadly speaking, you come across as cautiously optimistic about the future of the ecology around us. Do you think that's accurate, or are you getting ready to say goodbye and things just get worse from here?
Mm. And I've seen lots of longleaf destroyed since I wrote that book, and every time I saw it, it broke my heart. It just killed me. And yet there's still a lot here. There's still much to work with. And we've lost and we continue to lose things that are not going to be replaced. And it's like every day is a death that you have to live through. People who are close to me would not consider me optimistic too often. But it is I mean, we have to be oxen about it. We have to be slow and steady. We have to keep moving because what is our choice? And I do think there are opportunities, and I do think there are ways back into the wilderness that are beautiful and that we can take advantage of. We have to keep working at it. I hope a new generation will take that up. I couldn't imagine living knowing that I wasn't doing anything for the place where I lived.
Mm.
I can't. It just doesn't even make sense to me to live otherwise. So of course I will. But I do, even knowing that, which is, I am optimistic that things are going to happen, and I'm hopeful that this episode, as cruel as it is, and as crude as it is, and as much as it's just depressing. But I do think that it is. I do think it may offer us a chance to really get serious about rethinking some of the things we do. And I'm cautiously optimistic about that. It's not going to happen next month. There's going to be a lot of pain that we go through to get there, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we may find a way to rethink how we live that makes it easier for us to live.
I hope you're right. I think there is a very real chance, to your point, that this may be kind of our rock bottom moment that you say, how did we get here? Maybe we need to be a little bit more serious about some of these things that we care about. Watching climate change accelerate, every expectation of climate scientists being just absolutely smashed. Something needs to shift. And I think we cannot, for many people, we can't hide and stick our head in the sand as much as we could in the past. And then seeing our government actively, aggressively defund anything that gives us a fighting chance, in some ways, I think demands that people that care about it find a way to do it themselves. They can't say, well, if the government cares about the continuation of this country, then they're going to figure it out. No, we need to. That's our job. This is our community. These are our forests. These are our prairies. I don't think there's any illusion that the government's going to step in and fix these problems for us anymore, for better or worse, in the sense that, again, we have some of that accountability to ourselves that we may not have had in the past, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we weren't going from nirvana to hell.
No.
We were going from getting close to hell to being right on the coals.
Yeah.
I think we have to understand that we were on a bad path anyway. And we were. I mean, there's no question. We weren't doing nearly enough to think about biodiversity. We weren't doing nearly enough to think about health of forests. We weren't doing nearly enough to think about climate change and to deal with it. We weren't doing nearly enough to think about how we help people who are impoverished and how we accommodate them in our system so that they benefit as well. All of those things, we just hadn't gotten there, and we weren't moving towards them very fast. I guess there was a big change in the realization that we weren't getting there very fast over the past several months. But in fact, it's been a long-term thing. Maybe this is the wake-up call that will help us to see our way to a better future. People are stunned right now. And I think we're going to see a lot more action and a lot more thoughts and maybe a lot more creative thoughts. I think we're going to see a lot more divergence of opinion and thought. I see that already happening even within both parties about how things work. And that's going to make for a lot of really heated arguments. But, maybe that's going to be a good thing for us.
Yeah, I hope so. Can't be a bad thing at this point.
Yeah.
So, Bill, for folks that want to get your book, where can they find it or find some more of your work?
Yes. So you can always check out what we're doing at Paint Rock, which is very interesting. We write a newsletter there. I'm a little behind because we got so busy this spring doing cool research. Now I got to catch everybody up on it, but we have a great newsletter at paintrock.org. That's pretty simple. PAINTROCK.org. If you, our book is in its fourth printing. It's freely available from Amazon and from from some other booksellers. It's a University of North Carolina imprint. Buy it wherever you like. Our royalties go to conservation. We don't profit from that book, but it's a really fun book. I always say everybody's going to look at my wife's pictures, and one of these days they'll actually read the copy, and that's what's going to happen. You're going to look at this book and you're going to say, "Wow!" And I can say that freely because I took one picture. My wife took all the pictures. They're beautiful. They're stunning. She's a great photographer from way back. And it will give you this sense of the savanna system that we're talking about and a real sense of how it's different and how it's beautiful and how it can be stunning. And Andy, New Jersey pine barrens, when you see those beautiful pictures of the longleaf and those grasses, a lot of the pine barrens should be looking like that too. It gives us a real model because of my wife's photography to do it. And you can read my copy when you get around to it.
Yeah, I'll try to make my way around to your words too.
Yeah. Longleaf, Far as the Eye Can See is the book. Longleaf, Far as the Eye Can See.
Yeah, and I'll have the link in the show notes.
Yeah.
Bill, this has been great. I'm really looking forward to seeing some more of your work. And If you figure out a way to do conservation better or find a way to fund conservation better, let me know. I'm all ears.
Yeah, all right. We're working on it. We'll have more discussions.